but this is a gift for you.
Thank you.
That is the device I'm going to show you all later on tonight, which I call the intervalometer. And basically what it is, it's a ruler that measures the distance between notes. And we use the intervalometer to figure out all the different spellings that there are in the world. There are, a lot of people don't know this, but there are 12 notes in the scale, but there are actually 17 spellings. So if you wanted to learn how to spell the major scale, for instance, there's 17 spellings that you'd have to memorize. So it's like learning the times tables. And I don't know about you, but it took me about 2 years. You got times tables yet at school?
Yeah.
You have to memorize them forward and backwards?
Not backwards, but...
We had to learn them forward and backwards back in the 50s when I went to school. And then at the end of that, they would make us stand up in front of the whole class and recite the whole thing, all the way up to 12s. And I remember it took me 2 years. It took me 2 years to remember the
Get a PT with the whole, it has a whole thing in it, you can just always look at that.
Yeah. Lots of things up and down your arm. Pack twos, teacher.
It looks better in the folder.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, to memorize 17 major scales would take you about 2 years to memorize them all. It's not easy. And then there's what we call the natural minor scale. So there's 17 of those to memorize. Then there's two other minor scales. One's called the harmonic minor scale, and another one is called the melodic minor scale, and those are all used for writing music as well. So, and then there's the blues scale. So there are 5 basic standard scales to learn, and there's 17 spellings of each. Now you know why it takes 40 years for someone to learn music. Oh, really? It just takes that much time to learn. You know, some people learn it in 10 years. Some people learn it in 8 years. You know, I haven't met anyone that's learned it in just a couple of years. And even the best musicians that I know who do ABC, they usually only go up to about what we call 4 sharps and down to 4 flats. So that's 4 plus 4 is 8, plus 1 is 9. So they learn 9 out of the 17, and they cheat. Don't read the others, or they read what we call a different spelling, called an enharmonic spelling of it. So the bottom line is that most of the scales, nobody plays. A lot of kids that are just born, you have to understand that evolution wired into our brain the ability to learn language intuitively within just the first 3 or 4 years of our life. So that really is the best time to teach language. Now, people forget music is taught as a technical skill, and it's taught as if you're learning engineering, which has been my objective to it. You know, I've hated that my whole life. Starting at age 4, learning to play the French horn. By the time I was 12, I was pretty bored with it all. And I learned my ABCs then, and playing French horn, which is in the key of F, there was no other instrument in the orchestra that I could relate to. Generally, if you go out, saxophones are in E flat and B flat, clarinets are in B flat, trumpets are in B flat. So if you go to the store and buy what they call the jazz standards, you can buy 3 books. You can buy the jazz standards in C, the jazz standards in B flat, and the jazz standards in E flat, and pretty much that'll cover most everybody. But there aren't any in F. So at age 4, I took on an instrument that was in the key of F, and I was the only person in the world, you know, in Chicago, playing in that key. So learning ABC, I had to learn it differently. Another thing is, most people, when you learn an instrument, for instance, if you're learning the saxophone or the trumpet, you're only going to learn what's called the treble clef, which I'm going to explain later on. You don't learn the bass clef. But if you're going to learn to play stand-up bass or electric bass, you just learn to read the bass clef. Only piano players have to learn both. Their right hand is the treble clef, and their left hand is the bass clef. Well, French horn have a 4-octave range. So at a very young age, I had to read both the treble clef and the bass clef. So I was forced into that. Then it turns out that a lot of French horn music in orchestra is only written for fox hunting. You know, it's all this English, you know, a lot of fox hunting stuff for French horns. It wasn't until people like Benjamin Britten came along who just really wrote beautiful melodies for the French horn. And people like Brahms and some of the guys who really knew how to write a good melody, Tchaikovsky, for instance, they started writing melodies that were interesting on the French horn. So when I started playing jazz on the French horn, I had this other whole problem of learning to read music. I now had to learn to transpose other people's music because I couldn't go out and buy French horn music with a jazz tune. You know, where does a French horn player go and buy Alfie? You know, or you want to do, you know, a jazz standard like Blue Monk. Where's a French horn player going to go buy the music for Blue Monk? Well, you're not. So you're going to wind up either buying the bass guitar version or you're going to buy a trumpet version or something like that and translate it from the key of B flat over into the key of F. So I learned to do this ABC translation in my head at a very young age, and I have to tell you, it was confusing. And even though I started at age 4 where I had this advantage of learning languages, by the time I was 12, I was pretty tuckered out. Really, I was confused, I was depressed. It seemed to be an almost monumental task. Fortunately, I discovered the vowel patterns. When I learned that you could just memorize a vowel pattern for a particular scale, and then at that point you didn't have to pay any attention, boy, that was a godsend. And then I was able to translate by just translating from one scale to another. So if I played something in the key of C and it wasn't going to be on the French horn, it was going to be played, I was going to play trumpet music, well, I knew I had to move it 5 steps. So I'd move it from F up to, you know, or from C, I'd move it to G, and I'd play the G scale and everything worked. And that was actually how I got into the music method that I developed, the numeric music system. It was through that, the pain and the anxiety and all the problems that that thing didn't answer, that gave rise to me looking for a simpler, easier, straightforward way that got rid of all of the problems. And another thing I should mention is people who learn to play things like trumpet or saxophone or baritone or bassoon and so on and so forth that are playing on what we call transposed instruments, they're basically taught lies. Because the key of C is the easiest key to learn to play in first, a trumpet player such as yourself learn to play your C scale, right? And learn to read the C scale on the thing, only to find out one day when he tried to read piano music that you weren't on the same page, sound-wise. So you find out that the C, the key of C that you're learning to play and read is actually sounding B flat. And a flute player or a piano player, if they wanted to play with you, have to be offset by one whole step. So you're actually playing the B flat scale while you're reading the C scale. So you're taught this lie, and that lie sticks with you. And you learn 17 spellings, and you learn to misread music in 17 keys. Until finally one day someone says to you, well, there's a difference between the scripted trumpet music and what we call concert pitch. And concert pitch, which is in the key of C, based on the light keys of the piano, half of the instruments in the orchestra play in the key of C. But the other half of the instruments play in other keys, and they're basically taught this lie. And they grow up thinking that when they're playing or reading the key of C, they're actually not on the same page sound-wise as concert pitch. So poor sax players, trumpet players, have to learn to translate, again, back and forth between these two things. They have to know that if the piano player is playing in the key of C, they have to play their D scale. They have to play a scale a whole step above to be on the same page. If you're playing alto sax, which is an E flat instrument, then the C that you've been taught is really E flat, and now you're 4 half tones off. So you have to learn to play in the key of A if you want to play with the piano in C. So all that I know is kind of confusing, but that's the way it is. Honest to God, it's confusing. And trying to straighten it all out is a nightmare. And so what I decided was do an end-around run and forget about it altogether and develop something else that didn't require all that thinking. And what happened is I discovered a gentleman from 120 years ago named Charles Whiting, who was a genius, who was the head of the Boston School music program in Boston back at the time of our founding fathers, the 1850s, 1840s, and he came up with this idea of reading by number and teaching kids to sight read by number, and then also later teaching them the ABCs. So this method that I have actually started 120 years ago by Mr. Whiting. It's just that he never developed a way for teaching people to actually read it on the staff, so, which is what I've done, and then use it to analyze music, like classical music and jazz music, and figure out all these more complicated things that we have to do in music. I've figured out how to do them all by number or interval. So I've kind of taken off on what he did.